Hi, today I am going to discuss an important topic which is the focus of questions in the critical care exit examination, and that is the measures of ICP reduction. High intracranial pressure has been classically defined as an ICP more than 20 millimeter of mercury, and according to Brain Trauma Foundation 2016 guideline, ICP more than 22 millimeter of mercury is regarded as high ICP. So this threshold may be anywhere between 20 to 22 millimeter for the trigger of treatment, and it can actually cause the secondary brain damage if you don't control it, and death also, and therefore intracranial pressure elevations should be aggressively treated. Before understanding the measures to control ICP, let us understand the etiopathogenesis. Cranium is a rigid box, and there are three main components: brain, blood, and CSF, which have occupied certain volumes inside the limit of skull box. The Monro-Cayley hypothesis states that the sum of intracranial volumes of blood, brain, CSF, and other components is constant, and that an increase in any one of these must be offset by an equal decrease in another component, or else the pressure will increase. Therefore, high ICP can be due to either increase in the volume of brain tissue, blood, or CSF. Okay, and most often it is brain tissue because it occupies most of the volume inside the cranium. Increase in the brain tissue size could be due to localized or generalized phenomena. Localized means that there is some space occupying lesion or mass effect. This shifts the midline of the brain towards the another side and compresses the vital structure towards on the other side. Even a small infarct can cause the same effect. Okay. On the other hand, there could be generalized cerebral edema. Now, the cerebral edema can be of 5 types. You should remember this because this is a short notes for the first paper in exit exams of critical care medicine, and if describe the types of cerebral edema. So, the types are: number 1, the vasogenic cerebral edema, which means that there is a disruption or the break in the blood brain barrier, which can lead to extracellular edema, which mainly affects the white matter via the leakage of fluid from the capillaries. Examples are hypertensive encephalopathy or PRES, that is posterior reversible encephalopathy syndrome. It can be generalized but seen as a localized phenomena on MRI. Osmotherapy and the treatment of precipitating cause is the most effective way to treat the vasogenic cerebral edema. Second type is the cytotoxic cerebral edema. As the name describes it, it is due to the cell disruption or necrosis, which is commonly seen in the cerebral ischemia, hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy, brain anoxia, etc. In this type, there is no disruption of blood-brain barrier, but there is a loss of integrity of cell membrane, and then what happens is that all the intracellular fluid is lost to the extracellular compartment. Now, we will talk about the third one, which is hydrostatic type, and that is due to the elevated hydrostatic pressure, the capillary hydrostatic pressure, typically caused by a severe arterial hypertension, not a venous hypertension. Arterial hypertension can cause the increase in the capillary hydrostatic pressure and hydrostatic cerebral edema. In osmotic type, sometimes known as ionic cerebral edema, the solute concentration of the brain exceeds that of the plasma, and the abnormal pressure gradient develops, which leads to the accumulation of water inside the brain parenchyma through the process of osmosis. The blood-brain barrier in osmotic type of brain edema is also intact. So, if somebody asks you the blood-brain barrier is disrupted in which type of cerebral edema, so your answer should be the vasogenic cerebral edema. So, the examples of osmotic cerebral edema may be acute hyponatremic shift or dialysis disequilibrium syndrome, which is usually seen in patients in whom you are dialyzing very fast and urea is reduced very fast in an hour or so. In interstitial type of cerebral edema, there is a which is quite a peculiar one. CSF moves from intraventricular space to the interstitial space of the brain due to pressurized ventricles with the CSF. So there is a periventricular CSF ooze seen on imaging. Patients with hydrocephalus or meningitis are the examples of those affected by this interstitial etiology. So after having discussed about the brain tissue as a cause of high ICP, now we will move on to the CSF causes. So whenever there is an increase in the volume of CSF due to either increased hypersecretion from the spatial ependymal cells of choroid plexus of the ventricles of the brain and absorbed in the arachnoid granulation. So sometimes hypersecretions of the CSF or the obstruction of CSF flow both can lead to the increased CSF volume and pressure. The choroid plexus is a network of blood vessels present within the sections of the four ventricles of the brain, and there is about 125 ml of CSF at any given time, and about 500 to 550 ml of CSF is generated every day at a rate of about 25 ml per hour. So that is the physiology you should know about the CSF. So this is the picture of CT scan. You can see over here with the hydrocephalus. In another picture, there is a IVH in the lateral ventricle, that is intraventricular hemorrhage. Now, so far we have discussed the tissue and CSF volume as the causes of intracranial hypertension. Now, last is the blood volume. So the ICP may increase due to venous distension in the brain or venous dilatation. Because the veins can accommodate more blood due to large capacitance compared to the arteries. So venous dilatation is the main cause, and that can occur due to venous obstruction, as we see in the cerebral venous thrombosis. Okay, in this cerebral venous angiography picture, here you can see the attenuation of venous anatomy in the left side, and you can see the compensatory venous dilatation proximal to the block in the right side of this picture. Okay, so you should also always know that brain hypercapnia should be avoided because it can cause venous dilatation. Similarly, any condition which lead to increased cerebral metabolism, such as the fever and also seizure, can also cause the functional hyperemia and increased intracranial pressure. So all these things should be prevented. After having completed the understanding of the etiology of high ICP, we will move on to the management part. So the management of the intracranial hypertension is studied in two sections. The first one is the monitoring part and another one is the treatment part. So this in this exit examinations of critical care, monitoring of ICP is frequently asked. So you should be very thorough with this question. So ICP guided therapy has been cornerstone in managing severe traumatic brain injury or subarachnoid hemorrhage cases. So ICP monitoring allows for the judicious use of interventions with a defined target point and thereby avoiding the potentially harmful aggressive treatment. There are criteria to start the ICP monitoring or to consider the ICP monitoring. You should know. The first criteria is that there should be a SOL visible on the brain imaging. So SOL is space occupying lesion, or there should be some cerebral edema, severe cerebral edema. Patient should have a depressed level of consciousness, GCS should be less than 8, and also an abnormal CT scan. So these are the important indications for ICP monitoring in ICU. Now regarding the devices used for the ICP monitoring, there are various types of these devices available. Few are intraventricular, few are intraparenchymal. The major intraventricular and intraparenchymal devices for ICP monitoring are available, and there are few questions which may be asked in exams, such as which is the most accurate device, or which is the gold standard which is associated with the lower infection rate or lower hemorrhage rate or lower complications, like that. Many questions may be asked regarding the ICP monitoring, and you should be very thorough with these type of questions. So remember that intraventricular catheters are the gold standard for ICP monitoring, and they are very accurate but require special expertise for insertion. They are not very easy to insert, and you require a neurosurgeon. On the other hand, intraparenchymal devices are very easy to place and there is less chance of infection and hemorrhage while placement, but not so accurate these devices are and very expensive too. So, here is the picture of LecoGuard, which is a new ventricular type of monitoring device which is very kind of automatic. So, it detects the high ICP pressure or high CSF pressure and it automatically removes the CSF to maintain the ICP. So, that is quite good. And now you should know that what should be exact level where these the transducer of these devices kept. Okay, the positioning of these or leveling of these transducers is usually at a level of the brain center when the patient is either supine or in the lateral position. Okay, so the brain center is at the level of external auditory meatus or at the level of glabella. You should know all that. So, once you insert the device, there are ICP pathological waveforms which will be visible and usually include the Lundberg A, B and C types. So, you should know about those waveform, how they look like. And Lundberg A wave or the plateau wave are the ICP elevations to more than 50 millimeter of mercury and lasting for 5 to 20 minutes. So, Lundberg A wave are malignant waves and they are usually for longer time compared to the Lundberg B waves, which are pressure pulses, have an amplitude of 30 to 50 millimeter of mercury, but they are very frequent. Every 2 minutes, every minute they will be appearing on the screen. Lundberg C waves have an amplitude of 20 or 10 millimeter of mercury and their frequency will be at every 4 to 8 minutes and they are seen even in the normal ICP waveform. So, after having completed the devices and the waveform, let us move on to non-invasive ICP monitoring. So, what are the non-invasive monitoring? So, it can be with the help of the direct ophthalmoscopy or fundoscopy or ocular ultrasound. Okay, so these are the bedside techniques and mostly available in virtually all the ICUs and they can suggest the high ICP and treatment may be tailored accordingly. So, very useful non-invasive monitors available. So, let us move on how we can control the high ICP. So, there are generalized steps and then there are active medical and surgical therapies aimed to decrease the ICP. So, simple measures include head end elevation to facilitate the cerebral venous drainage and keeping the head in the neutral position. Okay. And then hyperventilation is also suggested, which is a rapid but a short term measure to control high ICP. The target PaCO2 will be 30 to 35 millimeter of mercury. You should not over aggressively hyperventilate the patient because even hypocapnia can cause the cerebral vasoconstriction and the outcome may be very bad. Another simple measure is to start the sedation and analgesia to decrease the cerebral metabolism. Avoid the seizure, avoid fever, hyperglycemia, hypoxia, hyponatremia. It is very useful because they can prevent a secondary brain damage. Medical therapy using the osmotic control, otherwise known as osmotherapy, is very important. Okay, the most common and most effective osmotherapy which we use in the ICU is the mannitol, and you should be again very confident about the theoretical aspects of the mannitol. Mannitol lowers the ICP within 5 minutes with a peak effect at 20 to 60 minutes, so somewhere at 45 minutes, and it lasts for about 1.5 to 6 hours. The dose of mannitol varies from 0.25 gram per kg to 1 gram per kg body weight, and when you want to decrease the ICP fast, you have to use the higher dose, that is 1 gram per kg body weight of the loading dose. Monitor serum osmolarity and target this between the 300 to 320 milliosmol per liter. Oral glycerol may be used for the same purpose, and sometimes we can use the oral glycerol when we want to taper down the mannitol fast. Other effects of mannitol: it can improve the microcirculatory rheology and has a free radical scavenging effects. Okay, so that may be asked in exam. Mannitol opens the blood-brain barrier, and mannitol has the tendency to cross the blood-brain barrier, and if it crossed and then it can draw the fluid into the central nervous system, which can aggravate the vasogenic cerebral edema. For this reason, when it is time to stop the mannitol, you should slowly taper to prevent a rebound cerebral edema and high ICP. Okay. Recent human trials suggest that the hypertonic saline may have a more profound and long-lasting effect in reducing the intracranial pressure following traumatic brain injury and when compared with mannitol. However, the effectiveness of the hypertonic saline compared to other intracranial pressure reducing agents in the management of traumatic brain injury is still debated. So, according to a recent Cochrane analysis systematic review, hypertonic saline is not better or superior than mannitol in efficacy and safety. So, if somebody asks you which agent you will use, so you say mannitol, but you always say that hypertonic saline is equally effective. But because you are more comfortable with mannitol can be used. If somebody asks you what are the differences between the hypertonic saline and mannitol in neurology, then definitely you should know 4 to 5 points. So, you should know that the reflection coefficient of hypertonic saline is 1. That means that blood-brain barrier is completely impermeable to hypertonic saline, whereas in case of mannitol, the coefficient is 0.9. So, in about 10% cases, the blood-brain barrier will allow the mannitol to move, and that is the reason mannitol should be tapered slowly. Now, regarding the interventions, an external ventricular drain, which is also known as the ventriculostomy drain, can be used as a monitoring as well as the therapeutic strategies to drain the CSF. Very commonly by neurosurgeon, typically a burr hole is created through a small incision behind the hairline here, and the catheter is passed through the brain and into the frontal horn of the lateral ventricle. Okay, so that is the place for catheter tip, and you can always measure the CSF, and if it is high, then you can probably remove some of the CSF. Finally, if none of the above measure is able to control the ICP, you have to go for the malignant option, which in this case may be the decompressive craniectomy for the diffuse pathologies such as the large hematoma or ischemic infarct, or a limited resection of SOL may be also viable option. Surgical options are very permanent solutions to raise IPC. But the problem is the nosocomial infection of wound, flap and meninges. So, in conclusion, my approach to ICP lowering strategy has a stepwise fashion associated with a continuous check of efficacy of the therapies. I will start with the simple measure and escalate to the osmotherapy and then surgical intervention as a final resort. This will allow me to de-escalate the ICP lowering strategies as soon as possible within 24 hours. Okay, so now we have completed the theoretical part of measures to reduce the ICP. I hope that will be very useful for your exam preparation. So, thank you so much.